Um, there we go. Recording is now in progress. Excellent. I'm Dr. Jonathan Douglas. I'm a psychologist with Central Ontario Psychology in Barrie, Ontario. And I want to thank you for joining us for this very special panel discussion, and a very important one. And it's timely, and you know that this is September being Suicide Awareness Month, and we are also dealing with World Suicide Prevention Day, and hopefully that's something that we can learn a little bit about here. So this month, the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment, or as I invariably call it, CIPSRT, is endeavoring to share resources about public safety personnel, their mental health, how to destigmatize mental health challenges. And with this panel discussion, we hope to contribute to the World Suicide Prevention Day and call to start the conversation about suicide. Sorry, I'm just going to move something off my screen there. Very good. Every conversation that we have about suicide is so important because it encourages us to speak to it, to open up the conversation. And it's one thing that we've certainly learned is the importance of being able to converse about these things. We want to invite you to visit and to share CIPSRT's suicide awareness website, Understanding Suicide and Public Safety Personnel. You'll be able to find additional information and resources there, and a link has been provided in the chat. A video recording of this panel discussion will also be located there after the session. We may be discussing some things that can be triggering. We may be, I don't think we're going to be describing any great detail about any traumatic events or anything like that. But should anyone be experiencing any immediate concern, a fantastic resource, which I hope everyone is aware of now, is that Canada's Suicide Crisis Helpline is now nationalized. It's available at the number 988. That can be both phoned or texted. It's available 24/7 every day of the year, and it's a really, truly wonderful resource, simple, easy, and accessible. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge the land on which the webinar is being hosted. The Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment is housed at the University of Regina, which is located on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories, the ancestral lands of the Cree, the Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota nations, and the homeland of the Métis. I'm speaking to you from Barrie, Ontario, which is on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people, including the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi nations. And we also acknowledge the Wendat Nation, or the Huron, who occupied these lands prior to the middle of the 17th century. And it is with a gratitude that we offer this land acknowledgement as a small part of the ongoing conversation toward reconciliation. I'd like to move on to some housekeeping issues. All of the attendees will be in listen-only mode to limit background noise, and attendee cameras are also off by default. As mentioned, today's session is being recorded and will be made available online. We have set time aside for lots of time, I hope, for your questions, and please feel free to send us those questions at any time through the Zoom questions box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. We're going to answer as many of those as we can. This event is being presented in English with the option of simultaneous captions or audio translation in French. Please use the link in the chat, which will enable you to log into Worldly, our simultaneous translation platform. Be sure to select French in the top right corner and keep this window open throughout the meeting. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists. Dr. Alison Crawford is a professor at the University of Toronto Dalla Lana School of Public Health, and she's also the Chief Medical Officer of the 988 Suicide Crisis Helpline, for which I thank you because that's such a fantastic resource that I love sharing, and I love being able to put that on my voicemail. If this is a crisis, here's the number to call. So nice and easy to remember. Dr. Christine Genet is associate professor at the University of Montreal, Faculty of Nursing, and she is principal investigator of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research funded project, the recommendations for culturally sensitive and intersectional practice in suicide prevention intervention for public safety personnel, a qualitative approach. And I think we'll have a lot to learn from that. And Laura Kloosterman is it's so familiar to me. Lori and I have worked closely together over the years through Badge of Life. I used to be on the board of Badge of Life. I continue as an advisor with Badge of Life. And Laura has joined Badge of Life as the executive director. She has 32 years of policing experience in various positions throughout the Ontario Police Service. And it's always a great pleasure to see you, Laura. Thanks for joining us. So welcome to everybody, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. So thank you for your interest in this important and at times painful subject. It's a subject that until recently was so painful and difficult to discuss that we rarely discussed it. First responders would suffer in silence, and when their silence became permanent, other first responders might try to protect the memory of their colleagues by covering it up, pretending it wasn't happening. We've obviously changed a great deal from those early days when too many were so-called cleaning their guns when they lost their lives, and today we're able to speak to that more directly. I had the honor personally of being on the board of the Ontario Psychological Association during the very years that I think our culture was really beginning to change, and increasing our willingness to discuss suicide. During the time I was on the board, the media spent a year in Ontario with a running tab of every first responder suicide in the province. That had its pluses and minuses, I think, because I think one of the dangers is, to set up the belief that, dealing with mental health challenges inevitably ends in suicide, which is very, very far from the truth. But the positive side is that it forced us to start paying more attention. In Ontario, that led in 2012 to the Solicitor General's report on the problem of suicide among members of the Ontario Provincial Police. And finally, in 2016, we achieved presumptive legislation, which forced our Workers' Compensation Board to accept claims for PTSD among first responders. PTSD had always been covered, but it used to require that the claim was made with reference to a specific traumatic event and within a certain number of months after it had happened. Claims for the cumulative trauma, which would follow decades of exposure, would be put down to the nature of the job. So if you were phoning, workers' comp and you were saying, I've got this issue, they'd say, well, tell us about the event that caused it. If the response was, take your pick, I've got 30 years worth, the answer was, sorry, we don't cover that. And of course, that was absolutely tragic. The result of the presumptive legislation was the breaking of the logjam. There is huge pent-up demand in the system as a result of, the belief that claims would not be accepted. And so once they were accepted, claims, of course, skyrocket naturally. As many older first responders in particular, some of them nearing retirement, found that they couldn't quite manage the job, and could cross that finish line of their careers. They began to go off work and to seek treatment. And given the complexity of their condition after so many years without treatment, they frequently, they would not be returning to work. The conversation about first responder suicide and the role of occupational trauma in causing it had finally started. Stigma began to diminish somewhat, But soon the number of claims being made and the number of first responders who were off work and not returning quickly began to increase the demands on those who were left on the job. Frustrations began to mount for the employers and for the co-workers, and employers began to push back, sometimes by challenging claims. The result was counterproductive for everyone. Workers felt increasingly stigmatized once again, feeling shame if they went off for their mental health and guilty for increasing the demands on their peers. Employers thought they could save money and maintain their workforces by pushing back against these claims being made. But instead, what they did was they increased the embitterment of their workers. And they began to discover that embittered workers forced back to work prematurely don't do great work. They don't end up staying on the job successfully. And, that again, it just causes more harm. I've spoken frequently on the topic of sanctuary trauma. It's not actually a trauma per se, rather it's because it doesn't involve physical horrors. What it is, it's the second, usually the bureaucratic injury that occurs when an injured worker is expected to receive the support of peers, the employer, the compensation board, and what they experience instead is rejection and stigma. The resulting embitteredness literally slows their recovery and makes a successful return to work less likely to happen. Sanctuary trauma also causes a great deal of hopelessness, meaninglessness, and suffering. And so we can certainly understand, those of us who work with suicide understand the power of those words and what that can mean. Here in Ontario, I've watched as the presumptive legislation began to make life so much easier for those chronically exposed to horrors in the workplace. But I've also witnessed how our workers' compensation board turned 180 degrees, from being the most difficult third-party system I had to deal with when it came to advocating for necessary care prior to the presumptive legislation. 180-degree turn to being one of the easiest. It became such a joy to work with these cases and even with the workers' compensation board. And I've watched that 180-degree turn come back about 90 degrees. So there's been some backsliding. It's no longer quite so easy as it was. Sometimes we see claims which are, because I'm diagnosing, they are forced to accept the claim, but they end up with this weird counterproductive loophole where they'll accept the claim and deny the income replacement, which is mind-boggling when this occurs. Because you can imagine, as I'm trying to deal with a worker's trauma, trying to treat that trauma, if that person's going without an income, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? It becomes very difficult to make, impossible, in fact, to make meaningful psychological gains, under those circumstances. So these are the kinds of issues that I'm sometimes confronted with. And they drive so much of the work that I do and so much of my passion in trying to address some of these things. I know as a psychotherapist, my job is to help the individual deal more effectively with the world as it is. But outside of my therapy room, I'm trying to change the world. And I appreciate so much that the panelists here, all of us here, I think are committed to changing that world as well. And that's what makes this work, and this panel so very important. So having set, what I'm doing here and what brings me to this work, I want to turn now to the panel. And let's invite each one in turn to tell us a little bit about their own work, their own expertise, their own experience with the topic of suicide and how it interacts with personnel, safety personnel, and their mental health. So let's start with Alison Crawford. Can you speak to us a little bit about who you are, what you do, what you're doing here, and how you're going to change the world?
Okay, thank you for that invitation, and it's really good to be here. I'm so glad you mentioned 988, Jonathan. That's obviously the main context for my work right now. And 988 is it's 988 Suicide Crisis Helpline. It's available by text and chat across the country. We have a whole network of providers so that when people call or text, they get support in English or French close to home. And one of the like our drives right now is to understand, so it is accessible to everyone in Canada. We hope it becomes as familiar as 911 for people who are thinking about suicide or for their loved ones. And we're also trying to make sure through a variety of community engagement and also research that it's a meaningful service to people. So we have a CIHR funded grant called the Respond Study, and that is working with public safety personnel groups across the country. And I do want to give a shout out to a few colleagues, to Giselle Castillo, Thiaki Rajaratnam, and Fatima Ahmed, who helped. They're very deep in the analysis of that study right now. And we have a host of collaborators as well that are familiar to this community. I won't list them now, but this is really this work. And what I will say is it very much involves people who are part of this community as co-researchers. So from across different public safety personnel groups, they're very actively involved in kind of co-creating our knowledge of crisis services. And where we are in the research right now, I'll just give you a taste. We've finished a national survey. I'm going to see if I can somehow put a link in. We're still looking for people to respond to that. And right now, what we're doing is looking at calls and texts to the National Suicide Prevention Line that are from public safety personnel to understand, there are multiple reasons for calling, some of the barriers to that, and what they're hoping for, so that we can use the actual experiences to inform the service. We've also made some changes already. We now have a field in our call and text contact report where we inquire and record if someone is calling from a public safety group. We've heard from, again, across all of the groups. And we know when people call, they're calling for a variety of reasons. Usually, some of the common ones: grief and loss, you mentioned some of the workers' compensation getting covered, so a lot of like housing and financial concerns, physical health challenges, relationship conflicts. So one of the things that's really coming up that I think Laura's going to touch on is like the family and the people in their lives, and the importance of that. And I'll just touch, there's so much I could say, but the really strong emotions that people have: shame, helplessness and hopelessness, many of the things that people across this community would relate to. And so we're trying to understand those needs. Some of the big barriers that come up are around access to mental health supports in people's communities, particularly people living in rural communities. Financial concerns, so not seeking mental health support because they're worried about finances. And then just some, I know we're going to talk about this, general barriers around help seeking that have to do with stigma and shame, very commonly, past negative experiences with mental health. So of course, then that acts as a barrier to seeking future support. A lot of concern around confidentiality and concern about their impact. So stigma's on one hand, but another common thing that we see is worry about that they're going to burden someone else, whether it's their direct colleagues or even in seeking support, that reach out will be difficult for someone else. And I'll just maybe end at this point with, so we do see people, they're obviously calling a suicide crisis line. So we do see a lot of suicidality amongst the people who call, but mainly, which I take it in as an opportunity. We see a lot of suicide-related thinking, so that gives an opportunity to intervene and have those conversations, and that's what we're trying to co-design right now. What is the best way to do that intervention? Which I can, of course, and I do want to also highlight the many protective factors. Like we're also hearing, the importance of family and friends, of work and school goals, of coworkers, And again, that opportunity around ambivalence, it's not always a wish to die. And we see this in suicide prevention, it's a wish to end pain and suffering. And so that is an opportunity when we can have those conversations with people. I'll leave it
Yeah,
for now.
that makes so much sense. So there's a lot there I want to follow up on. I could probably spend an hour just talking with you right now based on that introduction, Allison, but I don't think that's the best use of our time at the moment. Christine, let's hear from you.
So my name is Christine Jeunesse. So my native language is French. So that's why maybe sometimes I will be looking for some of my words, but I'm doing research on suicide prevention for many years now. And recently I'm looking mostly at public safety personnel. I've been working in Quebec on an action plan for suicide prevention for police officer. So we develop an action plan for all the police settings on how to prevent suicide. And in research, I'm looking at correctional officers, and I see that there's a lot of difference amongst those categories or types of public safety personnel work. So police, firefighters are usually more knowledgeable about suicide prevention, post-traumatic stress disorders. They talk more about it. When I'm going in correctional settings, usually when I'm saying that I'm doing research on suicide prevention, correctional officer turns around and shows me the inmate, and they say, "Oh, there are the inmate," and I say, "No, I'm not looking at the inmate. I'm looking at you." And oh, no, we don't have suicide ideation. And then some guys start to talk about what is living and all that. So there's a lot of stigma to work in those settings because they are less aware of suicide prevention, the fact that suicide, and even though suicide ideation is higher in those groups than in police officer and firefighters. So there's a lot to do in those settings, but it's kind of, the stigma is still really high. So that's why with the research project with the 988 line, I was thinking about the fact that we cannot have a one-size-fits-all intervention for all those public safety personnel. There might have some needs that need to be addressed specifically for police, firefighters, correctional officers, other correctional workers. So that's why I was looking at those aspects, and not only like PSP are not a one size population. They are different. And we need to address those differences. And I'm really interested also in as you said previously, Mr. Douglas, the fact that we usually look at the individual. There's a mental illness. We're looking at what's wrong with the person, but it's not always only the person. The person is living in a society, in a work environment, and we need to acknowledge all those factors that might impact the person. And even though we try to work on the individual and we don't look at all that's going around him, we won't have the solution. So that's why the vision that I have when I'm looking at suicide prevention is in an ecological framework, looking at all the environment and all those factors that are going around the person and not only the individual, because it's only one aspect of the problem.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I think that is, you raise again, you're raising such interesting points. I mean, I know there's a lot of discussion these days, certainly in social media, the value of diagnosis, where we have people self-diagnosing, or we have people saying diagnosis is useless, and in this area, one of the most important aspects of diagnosis is typically it's the first step towards compensation and access to treatment. Without a diagnosis, there is no injury. Without an injury, there is no claim. And so, that's certainly an important part, but we can't lose sight of the systemic influence over the development of that injury or its maintenance, or, the failure to respond effectively to it. And you raise interesting issues as well. Again, don't want to spend the entire hour, but the issue of corrections versus others, That's a very important and intriguing thing. I bet you Laura's ears went up on that one as well, because, I know we have a lot of experience in terms of dealing with corrections, and I agree. I think in a lot of ways it's a unique culture. So over to you, Laura.
Excellent. Thanks, Dr. J. So, I mean, I will kind of build on that point for corrections. Corrections is a lot like sending someone into a war zone, bombs going around and saying, can you just be happy? Can you just deal with things? And day in and day in and day in and day in. And I think that that's a very, very important piece. So Laura Klusterman, I am the executive director for Badger Life Canada. I am a police officer that's retired after 32 years of doing various things within the Ontario Provincial Police. I also I have very close ties to suicide because I am a member of the OPP. I have lost two people that are were my work partners to suicide. So when I took this position as executive director, it was not only to kind of be the change maker, like Dr. J said, and to change the world one step at a time. It was also because the whole suicide piece holds a very strong tug at my heart. I also have a sister who has been diagnosed with complex PTSD, and I've watched her struggle. So this is a very personal thing for me, and that's why, and that's what drives me. That's my fuel to my fire. What we're seeing, and I have the absolute honor of being a part of our peer support sessions on Monday nights for public safety personnel. It's virtual. We always have a mental health professional in the room doing a psychoeducational component. It's from people all across Canada. So I will never give that up because I get to see actually firsthand what people are talking about, what people are struggling with. And the sanctuary trauma, huge. There are so many people right now that have said, listen, I can go back to work. I can go back to work. I can't go back to work in that environment. And every time I speak to groups, I always say to people, how many people in this room know people that went off, came back, and then went off again?
Mhm.
Everybody's hands go up because they know somebody. And it is usually the sanctuary trauma. And that is, I think, very frustrating for myself and for others because that's changeable. That's fixable. That's how we're dealing with people. And that's a problem. That's a huge problem. What we're also dealing with now that has been a huge gap, and we kind of spoke about it before we started, is family members. We have peer support for family members of public safety personnel on every Wednesday. Same thing. I join so I can see what the struggles are. And it's not just spouses, it's parents, because we have a younger generation that is now starting, and the parents are like, I don't know what to do. Lots of the family, like lots of the public safety personnel, first responders are living at home. So like I don't know what to expect. Huge gap. And myself included, we always say public safety personnel, oh yeah, and families. That mindset is very, and I mean, I am to blame too. I do it all the time. For the most part, family members have been dealing with this for so many years prior to it ever coming to the surface. And then what do? We take the public safety personnel, we give them resources, we give them inpatient treatment, we give them all of this, send them off to for their support, and the family's still there. When the public safety personnel comes out of inpatient treatment, they come back to the same environment. It is no different than when we're putting, and I'm not saying that the house is a toxic environment, we're dealing with the same environment. So there has to be everyone on the same page. We don't do discipline for a kid and have a nice plan in school and not involve the parents. It's the exact same thing. We have to involve the family the entire way. And that's a huge gap because I know I'm working with someone right now and they're like saying, I want something. I want something for me, not something for me to help support my spouse. I want it for me because I'm the one that needs it because I'm the one that's been carrying the load for the last 10, 15 years. Huge, huge gap that needs to be addressed because we can't fix a problem unless we have come up with an entire solution for everyone.
Mhm.
And like you said, Dr. J, we're going to change the world.
One step at a time.
One step at a time. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Oh, that's so true. That's so true. I want to turn now to some questions to sort of open up the floor and be able to get some discussion going. And I hope that, there's a lot of crosstalk and argument and, raising of voices and shaking of fists and gnashing of teeth, because that's energy, people. And I know you're going to be a tough crowd. So just to pose a few questions. It's been about, by my estimation, I would say it's been about 15 years. I don't know if that sounds about right to everyone. But I think it's been about 15 years since we really started to pay attention to suicide in first responders and breaking that into the public consciousness. Um, has the problem of suicide among protective personnel, in your experiences, how has it changed in the past, say, decade? Are we getting anywhere, and what more can we do?
I can start if you want. We can see that I believe I'm an optimistic, so I believe there was some change over the years. We can see it with the police workforce and firefighters, since they are talking about police suicide many years from now, maybe 15, 20 years. They're talking about suicide in police officer, and they are trying to look at how we can prevent. In Quebec, even the forensic has now numbers of police officer that has died by suicide, because they identify those police. So they have numbers and they can say, this is a big problem. We need to do something about that. And there's money invest in doing things for police officer. And we can see that in the cultures, there's some change. The stigma has lessened. And when I'm talking with like liaison group in Quebec with police officer, they are aware of what is suicide prevention, how we can prevent it, what we can do, and how we can look for each other's. It's not perfect, but there's work that have been done on that part. And we see the difference with those population that has less talking about suicide prevention in the past year, like I say, correctional officer or communication dispatcher and all that. They talk less about suicide prevention, and we see that the stigma might be bigger in those institutions than in police officer, where the work has been done for many years. So that's why I'm optimistic that if we are talking more and more about how we can prevent those suicide prevention and how the cultures of the environment of the institution have an impact, I think that we can do something and prevent suicide.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. I think your perspective on the difference between police and the others is interesting to me, because I think here in Ontario, I see a little bit less of that. I think that it sort of tended to go more hand in hand. I sort of trace it back to Romeo Dallaire and Shake Hands with the Devil. 2003, I think that was published, and you know then that sort of opens the door for the military. Then the police, sort of came on board. But I think fairly quickly, locally, I would say the other, protective services began to, say us too, and rightly so. So it might be a little bit different in your experience, coming from a different province, that, things may have unfolded differently there. Others, let's hear from you two.
I wonder, just to layer into what Christine was saying about stigma, what we're seeing, and I think we're building the evidence base for this, because I also want to acknowledge your earlier point, Christine, about just the heterogeneity across these groups, and some of the unique things we see in these groups. For example, female public safety personnel seem to have unique and elevated risk compared to the general population, as just one example. But the distinction between stigma and self-stigma, to me, because we see, I mean, look at this event, look at CIPSRT, the funding, that more organizations and people are talking about mental health and suicide. But what we're still seeing, at least in our niche, is like that self stigma, that there's a pull, I guess. People, yes, we want to be more open about mental health and get support, but we also want to be the ideal public safety personnel, whatever your profession is. So that's a real tension, and that self stigma. I don't want to be the bad apple. I don't want to be the one that isn't the ideal or the one that's failed. I think is a huge barrier.
That self stigma piece is so what a great phrase to raise, because I think that's so critically important, because it's not just the stigma one receives, but the one, that we place on ourselves. I'm going to be a burden to others. I'm disappointing everybody, and I've let myself down. I'm the broken toy. All of these things are so powerful. Yeah. Laura,
And well, and I can kind of go, so I'm for corrections, Christine, you're absolutely right, because we've had in the province of Ontario more suicide of correctional officers, like for provincially, than ever before. I was in a meeting last week and we were with just corrections and management and things. It took 20 minutes before someone said, can we just talk about the elephant in the room? We've had more, and I'm like, that should be the first thing that is spoken about. And it's not only the like the completely obvious thing, ways of suicide. We're seeing now with correctional officers, more of them are using alcohol and drugs more and more and more and more. And when you talk about it, they're so flippant with everybody drinks.
yeah.
And I mean, I can say it from the policing standpoint, that's the way it was 15, 20 years ago. Is like, that's your coping skill. You go home or you go to a bar, your shift would go to a bar and things like that. And you drink your problems away. So I can see the shift that, okay, policing has, they've evolved into realizing it. Corrections hasn't yet. Because
Mhm.
when you say to corrections, like, how much are you drinking? And they're like, it's the big deal. That whole, thought process is still very much archaic with, that's, and when you say, are you doing it to numb things? Like, are you doing it as an escape? They're like, no, because everybody drinks. So
Mhm.
that's just kind of like, that's the way. And, and as far as like the self stigma goes, one of my biggest beefs is the word resilience. One
Mm.
Monday night, it was so powerful. Our mental health professionals started talking about resilience. So people were on, like the bend and don't break, and we can get through this. And there was someone that lifted up, rose her hand and said, listen, resilience is what got me where I am right now. Because
Exactly.
I thought I got to keep going. I got to put the blade down, and I can't let myself down. I can't let my team down. I can't let my family down because I know I'm resilient. I know I am. And I just can't take a knee. He stopped the entire meeting. And I was like, they're right. They're right.
Mhm.
Because we've used it as same as when, like, for Badge of Life, we're very careful about hero, warrior. Like, those are words that when you start policing, they're like, you are a hero. You are, and you're like, then you can't, then you tell yourself, I can't take a knee. I can't show any vulnerability and I can't show weakness because I'm supposed to be this person that is resilient, that's a hero, that's a warrior that just keeps going no matter what. And I think it's our language that is we need to be very careful with the way that we use it from the very beginning of,
Mhm.
from the very first day that we start talking to new recruits and saying, you're a human being. Like, you are a human being first, and so is everyone else. Because the danger is if we kind of do um, our words matter. And if we're saying to ourselves, I should be better. I should be better at this. I should be more resilient. Then we're gonna keep hitting the self-stigma wall day in and day out.
So powerful, and so profoundly accurate, right? Yeah, yeah. Resilience becomes viewed as a personality trait instead of a habit which is maintained by self-care and vulnerability. And it's so important to recognize that, but it's so hard to convey because we tend to view resilience as a feature of the individual, right? Rather than the result of that individual's actions and the support that they receive from the people around them. um yeah. Allison, you had raised the something which I have some passion about as well, which is the issue of the interaction between gender and these issues in public service. Because I think women are so frequently they're so frequently experiencing sexual harassment, sometimes sexual assault within the job, sometimes by the public, but frequently by their own peers. And I'm really curious for all of us, what we're hearing about that aspect of this, and are we doing enough to address those issues that are unique to women in these kinds of roles?
Yeah, that part, the systems part within public safety personnel, I'm probably not the best person to answer, but I know in healthcare providers, for example, there's the same pattern, and I'm sure there are many factors for it that I don't think we've untangled. And as a number of you have pointed out, just the systems level factors, the roles and responsibilities that women have, multiple roles and responsibilities that can sometimes be in conflict. But I think you raise a good point too about some of the unique traumas and traumatic events that women might be exposed to without clear institutional support all of the time. I think that's been very slow in coming.
Go ahead, Laura.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that that's one thing that we really don't talk about. I mean, that whole, and coming from a policing background, I mean, I was on the OPP, I started when I was 19. So I can, like, it was, and do we talk about it? We absolutely don't. Because they think that if we talk about it, then, like, organizationally, if we talk about it, then we must be wrong. Well, you're like, if you don't talk about it, that makes you wrong, and that makes you trying to hide something. So
Yes.
why not kind of like get it out in the open? Because when you look at things with the light of day, you're like, okay, well, let's sort through it, and can we do better? 100% we can do better. And to Allison's point, I've worked very closely with healthcare within corrections, which, through my fault, I never thought of. We go in, we talk to correctional officers. There is a whole separate group that is completely being ignored. And they are the ones that see trauma day in and day out. And when I speak to these nurses, they don't call them inmates, they call them patients. Because,
Yes.
and I mean, and my sister's a nurse as well, and my daughter's a nurse. They are the ones that, like, they're keeping everything together. So when you look at within the correction system, I know, like, whenever there's a death in corrections, there's an inquest. The nurses are the ones that making sure that there's not an inquest every day, because they are doing it they're just doing it. Like, when you ask them, like, why do you keep showing up for work when you are in these incredibly traumatic, environments and things like that? They'll tell their simple answer, I'm a nurse. And
Yeah.
so there's another end. For the majority, they are women. And it's, they do it. They just do it. And I think that that's another complete section that is, needs to be addressed and looked after and supported.
Yeah. Those in Ontario, when we came out with the presumptive legislation, and there is this list of what counts as a first responder, for the first year, nurses were not on that list. The nurses union stepped up to the plate and fought, and they got themselves added after a year. But in spite of that, the number of nurses we've seen in my practice, I would say probably 80% of them are nurses from correctional facilities, because of I think the unique, challenges and traumas that, you're describing there. And I think, that's such a great thing to highlight. That is, a really, really uniquely challenging role, I think.
But I think that also because as a nurse, I'm like, look at what you're saying, and I'm saying, okay, I can identify to those things. But as a nurse, I think that something's happening also in the correctional setting, because there's a conflict of values. Like, I'm going to do my work, I'm in a helping world. My vision is to help the patient. and I'm going to work in an environment where we have to, it's like coercive perspective of inmate. So there's might be the values are in conflict between what I'm supposed to do in the environment and what I'm there for. My works is to help the others, not to be coercive. And that might be also like creating distress for those nurses. And that's why maybe they are higher with the post-traumatic, not only because of the trauma. And that's something that I've heard, like for correctional and all that. Correctional officer told me in the research that they are not used, but they know that they will see some trauma. The trauma is not what is the most stressful for them, because they know that they will have to face some trauma. They're going into the work knowing that they will have to do, but all the tension that they feel between each others, the tension that they see with the organization, that's what matter the most, because they were not thinking about this when they enter the field, and that's what is the most hurtful for them.
Yes, 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 absolutely. And what you're speaking to, of course, is moral injury. Such a huge topic that not only does it deserve a whole separate panel discussion, SIPCERT's already done it. So check SIPCERT's website and look for the moral injury discussion there, because that's a whole topic in itself, and it's such a valuable one to dive into, and very, very eye-opening. The way in which when our values are in conflict with our duty, and that is such a profound topic, what should we be doing better to prepare the youngest members of these professions for the trauma they're going to be exposed to?
I have one very specific thing, so I could start, because I work in a sort of around these communities, but one, there was a comment in the chat, I think it was Randy. Thank you for the comment, Randy, and for sharing about colleagues who've died, wanting to honor them. And I'm thinking about this in relation to what we know in suicide prevention in general, how important it is to hear stories of survival, stories of coping, stories of people working through these challenges. So yes, we all want to honor people. And I think there's a particular tradition among some first responder communities of honoring, fallen heroes, and that we probably have to think carefully about, because there's other literature to suggest that the glorification, and unintended usually, glorification of suicide can be really an exposure effect for other people. So to really take those learnings and try to understand them within these professions. And so at the very least also promotes the stories of hope and coping and people who've worked through.
Yeah. So important. One of the things I'd like to, and I think this is happening, right? I think part of what we're witnessing is, there was this backlog of demand, and, so many people ended up going off because it hadn't been available for so long. And the situation, no doubt, is different in different provinces. And we end up with people going off work, and they're off work. I would say an average in my practice is probably a first responder is off work for a year and a half. So we're talking a very, very significant period of disability, right? What I'd like to see is people going off work much more readily, much earlier in their career, for a shorter period of time, repeatedly as necessary, right? Go off, get the help that you need. I tend to view psychotherapy in terms of dealing with trauma. It's kind of like learning how to drive a car, right? You can read the manual all you want, but until you're traumatized and practicing those skills, you're not really going to be able to get it down pat. And if you get traumatized again, you may need to revisit that. There may also be, good reason to believe that those who have been in treatment are now more resilient. They've got more skills to draw upon. I don't mean to use that word again. It just sort of fell out of my mouth, but it's they've got skills that they're able to draw upon to help themselves, to help, their peers, and they may be more readily, they may feel more comfortable reaching out for help again, which is great, right? Again, shorter periods of disability, more frequently across the career, I think would be something, that we should be able to work towards.
I'd like to see more proactive for organizations to start at the very recruit level to say, you know what, get a wellness plan in place. Start with, because there's three pillars, right? There's the organization management. Well, you're one of the pillars. So you need to get things in place prior to, because it's not like if, it's when. So let's get things in place for the good days, bad days. And when you do that, you have to incorporate family. You cannot do anything in a silo, because that's what gets us into trouble, is when we think I've got to do with this by myself. I'm in that silo. I can't let everyone else in. When you and because then when you do that, say for a recruit class, so I'm just like, let's say policing, you're standing there, you have all of these fresh young faces that are like, this isn't going to happen to me and I can't wait to get in there. And then you say, you know what, there's a real possibility. So let's talk about it. You've opened it up with an entire class. Let's start the conversation, because then they all feel, and it takes away the shame and the guilt, and of the conversation is open. And if you open it up with them, then they take it back. There's a potential of the ripple effect. They take it back to their detachment. They say to their coach officer, hey, do you know what this wellness plan? Like, do you know about, what do you do? And then you've started the positive skills. I say to every recruit I talk to across all fields, get a therapist. Get a therapist, because then you have a baseline, because then you feel comfortable going to someone and talking to someone, and it's natural, because when we're in crisis, that is not the time to be trying to find resources and things. If you have everything in place, then you've taken the control. You have the control, and you feel like, you know what, I can do this. I can do this, instead of spiraling out of control and not talking about it and just creating the silo, because that's where people get into trouble very, very quickly.
Absolutely, absolutely. What I'm observing, I think this is almost inevitable as we deal with this topic, right? Is that we start talking about, we go from this individual, this person in crisis, and we start, how do we treat, how do we prevent, how do we change the world, right? And I'm aware that, as we're talking about suicide prevention, there's these multiple levels, right? There is the level of how do we change the world and make it safer. I want to bring it back to the granular, bring it back to the individual. We're dealing with someone in our offices, we're dealing with someone, sitting in front of us who is now in a suicidal crisis. It's too late to change the culture, right? What do you see as the unique challenges in dealing with that first responder who is suicidal? Like, well, how do we, is there anything that we need to be bringing to our risk assessment, that might be different from when we're dealing with anyone else?
I think that I can say two things. So in our very preliminary analysis of these crisis interactions, I would say that it's actually a very similar flow of crisis intervention. It really is creating that non-judgmental space, really listening, and then moving into collaboration, because I think feeling empowered is really important to everyone, but maybe particularly so in these groups. But it's actually a very similar flow. But one thing that does come up time and again, and I know it's a very sensitive issue, is around means restriction. So we know there are certain, like, just very key things in the general population when we think about what works from a public health approach to suicide prevention, and one of them is means restriction. And yet we're working with groups of people where they're not in all of these groups, but where they do carry weapons or have access to other lethal means. And I think, I don't know the right answer, but I know there have been studies that show, for example, I think it was with the Swiss Army, that when they had to lock up their weapons at night and didn't bring weapons home, there was a radical decrease in sides, but when you selectively remove weapons from people, that's like, I shouldn't even call them weapons probably, but tools. When you selectively do that, I think that contributes to stigma. So how do we address means restriction, I think, is a huge challenge.
That I thank you so much for raising that, because I think that's, one of the greatest challenges, I think, in as we deal with this is, for a police officer in particular, that weapon is a piece of their identity, right? And when we're telling them, I think it's time to let go of that tool, right? It's not a tool. It's a piece of their soul that we're asking them to hand over, right? And yeah, stigma is, extreme in that moment. And it really does make it such a difficult thing. I know the standard that I have, by the way, in my own practice, and this is different from, not all psychologists necessarily do this, right? Well, that question will come up as a person is returning to work. Can this person have access to use of force? And my answers are twofold. Number one, no, this person is not ready. I see risk factors. This person cannot have it. My other answer is never yes. It's maybe. Do your own assessment. I don't want to be the one doing that assessment because I have this relationship with my patient. I don't want to hurt that person's feelings. I want that person to be happy with me. So how can I maintain my therapeutic relationship, right? If I'm going to be, saying maybe not, we need an independent evaluation, at that point to make that determination. And, I think that's a very important, distinction. And I don't know how often that is handled that way. I know a lot of smaller police forces can't afford their own in-house psychologist to do those evaluations. It raises all kinds of issues one way or the other. But it's a very important question and a critically important one, I think. Yeah.
Well, and I think for me, when you're on the road, like when you are working, you deal with, potential suicides all the time because people call in and then all of a sudden we have to go. And I remember saying to like my coworkers, you have to say the word. Like you have to say you called the line. We get a call because they think you're suicidal. Are you suicidal? Like, I think that we do a really good job of in certain spaces talking about it. In other spaces, we don't because we're too afraid. We're too afraid to, offend them, or maybe they'll think, oh, like I didn't think of that, or thanks for no, like just have the conversation. I mean, it's like like Allison said, you have to have the conversation, and you
Yeah.
have to don't beat around the bush.
Yeah.
And same with, I mean, coworkers, if there is a coworker that I believe is, suicidal ideation, I have come right out and said, "Are you thinking of suicide?"
Hmm.
Because I'm here. And
Hmm.
then don't do the, "Oh, oh," it's got to be non-judgmental. Don't
Yeah.
ask the question if you're not willing to take the answer.
Yeah.
And to even speak and say, "Okay, I don't know what to do next. I'm going to stand beside you and we're going to do this together."
Hmm.
That, and hold that space, and have the confidence in yourself to hold that space and to know what's out there and to be prepared for it is huge.
We have to destigmatize it within ourselves first,
Yes.
right?
Model behavior. We are never going to destigmatize unless we model behavior, and our own words matter.
Absolutely, absolutely. I feel pulled in so many different directions right now because there's so much we could talk about, but I want to turn my attention to our audience and the many questions that are flowing in, which is fantastic. So let me turn to some of our wonderful questions here, and I'm going to apologize in advance. I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them. So number one, I am an Indigenous police officer working for an Indigenous police service for 28 years. Recently, I asked to access Indigenous land-based healing programs that have been forced to use vacation days to get this healing because WSIB, that's Ontario, and my police service do not recognize it as accredited and acknowledged by the colonial system that knows that what I need for real healing. Knows, I think, is in quote there. Meanwhile, they are a significant part of my trauma. Has anyone else experienced this roadblock? Ooh, what a great question. You know, how do we effectively address this within that very unique cultural perspective, right? If no one else has any answers, I think I might take a crack at this one myself. Is that okay? All right. Taking off my moderator hat here. In my experience, what WSIB needs, number one, there has to be a diagnosis, right? So right there, you're into Western medicine. Again, we're stuck with the concept of there has to be an injury in order for there to be a claim, right? And that's an unfortunate reality, but it's the system that we currently have. You know, getting the proper healing in place, I think is critically important, and it has to be, as you point out, acceptable to the individual, right? I think it may be room for there to be a parallel here, and I've certainly seen this in the past where, there are programs, for example, that are not necessarily going to be recognized. Basically, any group program is not going to be recognized by WSIB, as a meaningful intervention unless it's based in a hospital. Again, highly colonial, highly westernized perspective on what what health is supposed to look like and what healthcare is, right? But you can absolutely do both in parallel, right? So if you're able to access the support, sometimes through the cultural services that are available, as long as it's running alongside, the other, it is certainly possible. But unfortunately, it is the way the system works, and it insists on its own path. And believe me, it's not just, within that unique cultural pattern that comes into play. But every time I think of, hey, here's this unique thing that we could try with this person, if it's anything slightly off the mainstream, it's going to be denied, right? Doesn't matter how much research there is. It can be, whether or not anyone else is doing it, right? If no one else is doing it, even if there's tons of research out there, the answer is going to be no. If it's not happening within a hospital, no matter what the research is, the answer is going to be no. So it's a constant, frustration as we deal with these systems. Go ahead, Allison.
Yeah, I also think it's such an important issue. I started responding in the chat, but so the cultural safety, but also like just the cultural meaningfulness. We just met with a group from New Zealand who work with Maori, and they offer a crisis intervention that is offered by Maori elders. And they have found that actually now everyone wants to go and see the elders. So we know there are lots of very valuable sources of healing. I do wonder about the I think the police have an Indigenous secretariat. Like, I think that advocacy is also really important here, and reaching out to public safety groups that represent Indigenous peoples, because I think this is a very valid and should be supported.
Totally agree. Yeah, totally agree. And I think a very valuable suggestion, right? If there are such, interactions available, it's an Indigenous policing service. They should be interacting with WSIB and making sure that WSIB is sensitive to these issues, right? The union should be stepping up and, this kind of a thing. And yeah, I think, WSIB is very slow to change, but they're not impossible to change. And, it's just they need a lot of pressure in order to bring that about. So, but thank you for a very challenging and important question. I wish I had better answers, frankly. Walking that line between holding confidentiality without reinforcing the stigma. Would love to hear any strategies that address that. Oh, this is brilliant. This is brilliant, because I'll tell you, my favorite, clients, patients, workers, are those that go out there and they become advocates, right? And they start saying, I got help and it worked terrific. You should go get help too, right? They're not worried about their confidentiality, and it drives me crazy in psychology. It's like, of course there's the confidentiality. If I go to my family doctor and I talk to my doctor about something, I don't want my doctor to go talking about, what I was talking about in that meeting, right? But I don't give a damn whether or not someone knows I have a family doctor. Of course I have a family doctor. In psychology, right? We tend to hide the fact that someone even has a psychologist, right? And I think that's we just need to normalize that. I think we need to normalize, that we seek help, and that means talking about it. Confidentiality is an obligation that rests on the professional. It doesn't rest on the patient, right? The patient can talk about their own stuff to the end of time, right? And I would encourage people, they can reduce stigma themselves simply by opening up. That's what Romeo Dallaire did. That's the huge difference that he brought about, in my opinion. He started talking about his own stuff and opened up the conversation. And people went, wow, I thought people, PTSD meant people trying to screw defense, right? That was the old acronym that used in the military. And when someone I respect starts to stand up and say, hey, PTSD is me, oh, I can either lose respect for that person or I can change my perspective. And a lot of people went for changing their perspective. And I think that's so important. It's on, it's not something I can do for the workers. There's only so much I can do as a mental health professional to reduce stigma. It has to be a grassroots movement. The union can be doing a lot about that. The associations can be doing a lot about that.
And that comes down to group peer support. I mean, there is nothing more powerful than the connection of community, of having 35 people on a call and someone sharing, and then another person giving a thumbs up or giving a heart. Like that simple, gesture goes, okay, and then you've started the conversation. And
Yeah.
and I think that shows, like, I mean, with our peer supporters, they have all been through it. And so
Mhm.
they get it. And when you
Mhm.
can have them be open and honest and authentic and vulnerable, and then have someone say like, "Wow, that's amazing. Me too," is the power beyond words.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any data/research on the total cost of addiction and or mental health on policing, and whether it's personal or family and organization? Christine, would you happen to have any data on your fingertips?
Nope, not on my fingertips, but I really like the fact when Laura was speaking earlier about families. I'm in the Garnet Family Partnership for the PSP, and it's really important not just to look at families as supporters of PSP, but as themselves having need. My husband is a firefighter, and sometimes I would have need to know what to do. At least as a nurse and as working in the field, I know what to do, but I imagine other women and other spouse not knowing how to manage the fact that he might be edgy, he might be responding that way to my kids, and how to manage the fact that the kids are anxious or all that, but they need to be support as people themselves. And suicide prevention is really something that is not done a lot. We are working with families to help to help the person that is suicidal, but those family members as themselves some things to do. So I don't have that as on the impact, but we should look at all those perspective and not only as supporters
Yeah.
of the PSP.
Yeah. And there's so many ways to slice that question of what are the costs, right? There can be what are the costs of providing the treatment, right? And we can measure that. We probably go, oh my goodness, those costs have gone up and up and up. Well, of course they have. More and more people are seeking it, right? And that's a good thing. And what's the opposite side of that? How many lives are being saved? What's the cost of the human suffering that's being offset by that? It becomes very, very complex. I know that in general, we look at like the cost of providing mental health services. In terms of productivity, it tends to feed back 5 times the cost. So it's incredible, you know, how valuable it can be to provide this. But right now, I think if you look at it, you know, if they're going to be measuring the cost and how many days are, you know, sick leave are being used, you know, what's the cost of the WSIB and the other workers' comp systems, you know, and we look at it that way, it's going to look very expensive. But I think in the long run, we're going to see a huge payback. Yeah.
And I always have difficulty with cost because what is a human life's cost? So money, it's one thing, but, and I know that society is led by money, and I know that, but the human life, what is the cost of the life, of the quality of life of someone or family? So it's okay to look at the cost effectiveness of things, but also to look at the human cost also.
Yeah, absolutely. I was intrigued about the part about talking about a colleague who has died by their own hand to help honor their memory and help those who are suffering. How do we all help those who want to not talk or protect the memory of a loved one? I'm a 24-year-old medic and now a public safety peace officer, so I have many connections and lost brothers and sisters, so I know the topic is delicate. Laura, I think you know, this is something absolutely close to the heart of Badge of Life. I know the issue of the memory wall has come up in Ontario.
Yeah, and it's a tough one. Like it is a tough one. I think that what we do, what kind of like the empowerment of ourselves and everyone else is so important. And I mean, it's no different than when I speak to someone, like when I do like a wellness debrief. Any death, you should be honoring that person. So you honor them by the way that you live and the way that you kind of like move forward. And like to Allison's point, it is like it's a fine line of whether we look at line of duty deaths. I mean, you talk to family members, all of a sudden, the death of their loved one has become, you know, front page news. And that's a very difficult thing, and it's a very fine line with how it's dealt with. And I think the biggest thing is the honor of what we can do, of the changes that we can make, of the, you know, the modeling the behavior and the help, and then paying it forward. And just kind of and do it in that way of what can I do to make the changes? What can I do to honor someone, to honor a death, whether it be a line of duty death, whether it be a suicide, or any death, to honor that person.
What do you think of something like the memorial wall, though, which, just to describe, you know, in Ontario, we have, you know, there's a memorial for, you know, police officers who have lost their lives in the line of duty. And there's been a lot of talk about how do we memorialize those who have lost their lives to their mental health, and whether or not we should. And is that, are we
it's a
making
line of
mistakes?
we have one
Yeah.
beautiful wall for line of duty deaths, and then we have, like, you know, across from it is the suicide. I might look at it in a different manner. I look at it from a personal piece of a very close friend who lost her husband to suicide. She works in that building and she has to walk by it every day. She's like, I walk by it every day. And so that is like, she's like, it feels like I never get that Band-Aid fully on.
Yeah.
And for us, like for me, I don't see it every day. Like I don't see that, you know, I think of him every day, but I don't see that every day. And I think that we have to really, again, it comes back to talking to a family member. What do you need? Like what
Yes.
don't and do not do something because it makes you feel better.
Yeah.
That is, you are doing it. Do not do it for a checkbox. Do not do it because, like, well, you know, I thought it was the right thing to do. You need to consult because every situation, we can't cookie cutter anything. Every situation has to be different. What do you need? And if someone goes, I don't know, then put everything on hold. Just put on hold.
I
Don't
love
just
that.
do it. Don't just do it because it helps us sleep at night, because that's not the right intention.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
But I believe that if you choose to do a memorial, it's kind of a good place to see if changes are possible. and to be careful for those that might be at risk themselves. So if you
Yes.
choose to do a memorial because the family want it, the institution want it, you have to be really careful, because thereby it might be stressful, or it might be impactful for people around. So assure that there's someone or services in place to help those that might have emotion or distress during
Mhm.
this memorial. It's really important.
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. I think there's a fairly brief one for Laura. You'd mentioned around the suicide rate. A question, did you say police in Ontario have the highest rate of suicide, or was it correctional officers?
I didn't say the highest rate. I said like right now there's been more correctional officers die by suicide in the last probably 3 years than policing. And if you look at what brought us to the Ombudsman report for policing, for the amount, the number, corrections has now superseded that.
That kind of doesn't surprise me, but I think it speaks to how corrections, first there was the military, then the police followed, then the other services, and corrections is coming up, bringing up the rear, Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. How do you address cultural differences in viewing mental health issues? Suicide is not considered as a mental health problem for many people. Very, very good question. Yeah. It probably has a big impact on who's actually even bothering to ask for our services, who's willing to make the claim, right?
I think it also highlights people's intersectional identities, and in a lot of these professions, the profession itself is such a strong part of many people's identity, but we forget that sometimes, so gender, racial and ethnic identification, urban and rural, growing up in poverty, many aspects of our identities intersect. And we come up with solutions for sort of the idealized police officer, firefighter, paramedic, whatever the thing is, we're not always taking into consideration those intersections. And I think the same thing applies to stigma. People face stigma from their unique vantage point. I know on 988 community consultation, like we've done, and even then we're recognizing like you have to do so much consultation in order to get those diversity of perspectives, and you have to be very purposive about it. But community consultation and involving people with lived experience, but diverse people with
Yes.
diverse lived experiences, and that's so important.
Yeah. I think there's always a couple of thoughts on it too. I know that, racialized communities within, public safety, one of the stressors they're often dealing with, not unlike the women in the sexual harassment, a lot of the those who are racialized are having to deal with a huge amount of racism, from their peers, often very open. These are sometimes people who are not afraid to use very offensive language, and oh, it was a joke and now it's on you for being offended, all this stuff that goes on. It's an additional stressor that happens. We have to be sensitive to the unique cultural influences that can, have an impact on how people express their emotions, how they express them. Sometimes, some cultures may be more comfortable expressing distress through physical symptoms than they are through talking about their feelings, things like this. But we also have to be super careful not to take that stereotype and say, oh, you are a this, therefore you must be like that. We always have to deal with the individual sitting in front of us. And, we need to be listening to them very carefully to help them, that individual, teach us about their culture. Because, just because I did that with, one, say, Asian officer doesn't mean that the next Asian officer's got the same experience. And if I I already spoke to an Asian officer, now I know what this is all about. No. We have to listen to everybody as unique. In a sense, I mean, it's making sure that we're doing that and being open to the fact that culture does play a role, but not letting it play the only role, because that's stereotyping. Yeah. Let's see. Do we think it's taken so long to recognize because corrections took so long to be recognized as first responders? I think it takes because, I mean, to be recognized as a first responder, I would say it's not so much they didn't necessarily get recognized as first responders, but they are invisible to the public, right? Police officers get, the pat on the back, thanks for your service. We have corrections precisely so that we don't have to think about corrections, right? They're performing this role for society, to sort of flush away our detritus, put it in a holding tank where we don't have to think about it. And of course, we therefore don't think about corrections officers. So I think that's a huge part of it. They are invisible to society, right?
And they also need to, they have a double stigma because they are taking care of the people that we stigmatize in the society. So that's even more difficult for them because there's the stigma of being, it's not a great job. It's not they even, when I talk to them, they don't even say to their entourage or their friends that they might be correctional. So they say that they are functionaries, they are working for the government. They don't tell what they are doing for work.
Yes.
So how to get help from the society when you don't even see that you deserve something because it's not worthy to be a correctional officer.
Yeah.
So it's kind of difficult for them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it is, there's a lot of unique challenges for corrections. My paramedical organization is quite affected by the suicide of some of our colleagues. These events are not recent, going years back. I hear a lot about how to support our people in the short-term aftermath of a coworker committing suicide. Do you have any advice on how to continue supporting our teams long-term? Great questions.
I know that in you
go
can
ahead. No, go ahead, Christine.
I'm gonna try to find the reference, but there's in Quebec, there's a postvention program that was developed for a different organization. And when they are talking about suicide postvention, like working with people surviving suicidal behavior around them, they talk about doing things 1 year, not just few days, but now it's thinking about long term and how to work in prevention also, because postvention is a way to do prevention also. So there is a program in Quebec. I'm gonna write the reference, and it's in English also, so you can maybe use that to help the organization.
Excellent. No, that's a great idea. Laura, did you have some thoughts on?
Same thing. Is that we're always like right out, like something happens and we have to, we get scissor in, we do everything like right. Well, it's time. Like and grief is time. So we can't, but there again, organizations want to go like, oh, check, and we can move on to something else. There has to be follow-up. And you have to keep them engaged, because if not, that's when people fall off. And you have to, like, it's just, so I mean, I would say things like any kind of coming up to any kind of anniversaries, you set time aside to do peer support, to do, to have come in and do wellness debriefs and wellness checks, and with, with mental health, with clinicians and peer supporters. And I always say everyone has, most organizations have their internal peer support. Absolutely amazing. What happens though is it's a confidentiality thing and a trust thing. So don't be afraid to go outside and to incorporate outside resources that are not tied to your organization.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Is resiliency a process? And, so resiliency being the outcome can fluctuate. Yes. I'll just answer that. Yes, it absolutely is a process. And so sometimes we are experiencing resiliency and sometimes we are not. That's absolutely accurate. Would that awareness and understanding help reduce the stigma? I don't know if it'll help reduce the stigma, but I think we certainly need to always be aware that resiliency is something that, we need to practice, and we need to sometimes step back and realize it's sort of like, that road to mental readiness thing of, are you at green or are you at yellow? Are you at red? Right? And, where are you in terms of what your need is right now? And what do you need to do, to, step back and, get the support that you need in order to be able to continue, or do you need to stop? Right. Go ahead, Allison.
Yeah, I just was to add on to that, Michael Unger's work on resiliency. So it's a process and it's also a resource that people have differential access to. So it is really important, again, to think about the systems and the communities around resilience. So resilient communities, and to think about taking strengths-based approaches as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We only have a few moments left. There's a very long question here that I'm just going to touch on very quickly. There's a lot more, that I don't honestly don't even have time to read the question. But has the whole discussion of suicide and the openness of it actually helped, in our opinion? Right. And I think it's complex. I do think it's complex. I think that, that year that we spent in Ontario tabulating every suicide does have the risk, as I was saying before, of setting up this schema. Right? A schema, is, hey, if I'm going to go on an airplane trip, that I need to drive the car to the airport, find my parking spot, and I have all these steps of the things that I have to go through and what the end of that process is, and my schema, guides my actions. If our schema of PTSD means the end point is suicide, right? Then that can be absolutely enormously dangerous, because that can become a self-fulfilling, prophecy. And we need to be able to talk about these things, but we have to always be aware of how we can reduce, the risks, how we can, become more effective at, managing those risks. And so ultimately, I think how we talk about suicide and what we do with that information becomes helpful. And as Laura was saying, the number of suicides we're hearing about in policing has dropped, right? And I think that's because that came about because we started talking about it. In the long, there may be that short-term risk, but there may be long-term gain, right? And that's what we have to keep our eyes on. And it's always going to be somewhat complex. And I apologize to the person who asked the question that I'm not paying enough attention to the full depth of that question, because I just think it's a valuable one to point to end on, because I think this very discussion today is part of that ongoing conversation. And I think the end result today is that we're opening our ears and we're opening our eyes, and we're trying to do our best. And I think ultimately that's what it boils down to. We value the mental health of public safety personnel, and we're going to do what it takes to ensure their safety. So on that point, I want to thank everybody for taking part. It's been absolutely wonderful. I love and thank you so much to those who organized it for inviting me to step on as the moderator. I really appreciate the opportunity. So thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Great meeting you all and speaking to you all, and I really appreciate your time.